Hi, I'm Jerrine Tan. I teach in the English department, and this is coming out of a class titled Cyberpunk in Asia that I'm teaching this semester, spring 2020, where I gave students a close looking assignment, and they were split up into groups and then paired up with a partner group to talk over two pieces of artwork that I had them look at. And Ellen Alford at the museum very kindly came up with these images with me to look at. So I'll let Ellen introduce herself a little bit.
This is Ellen Alvord. I'm the Associate Director of Engagement and Academic Programs at the Art Museum. And it's always a pleasure to be able to select artworks and be able to hear students' responses in the context of the class that they're taking. So the first work that students looked at for this assignment is a print by Wayne Thiebaud, and it's called Dark Country City from the series Fantasies of San Francisco, made in 1988. And San Francisco is actually a city that Wayne Thiebaud lived in and was very fond of. And so in some ways, he's kind of creating a portrait of the city here. In this work, it's kind of, a lot of the students mentioned in their comments the color scheme, which really focuses on these grays and blues with these dark areas in the center. And I think it's also really interesting the way he's constructed it with these strong geometries on the right and these more sort of curvilinear organic forms on the left.
Yeah, I think a lot of students picked up on the color scheme, as you said. And whereas I think for me, blue tends to signify a kind of calmness or the natural landscape with, the sky, the ocean. Here, a lot of students seem to associate that gray-blue combination with a kind of melancholia or a sense of something unfortunate or bad happening, right? A student wrote that they believed the intended message was a warning of the future, and that it seemed to signify to them a kind of dystopia with a geometric sort of cityscape on the right, and as you say, a kind of almost aggressive, organic, wave-like representation on the left.
Yeah, it almost feels like that large tsunami kind of wave.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Even though it's anachronistic, and yet it's interesting how when you look at an image in time affects the kind of associations that you make when looking at it.
And it also seems to bring up this theme of urban versus rural and city versus nature, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even the framing of the image, it's quite split down the middle. I think the buildings on one side and then that sort of like wave-like blob on the other. A lot of students, because of the San Francisco connection, tied this in or were reminded of the first novel we read for the class, in fact, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And that's a novel that inspired the 1982 movie Blade Runner by Ridley Scott.
So that's interesting that those movies were coming out at the same time as when Wayne Thiebaud was working on this series.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, those films, the films and texts of the kind of 80s cyberpunk genre were very much interested in questions too of humanity, right? So in Blade Runner, there are the humans versus the replicants or androids. And what's being investigated there is how we know what is human and what is non-human. And the idea of the non-human gets further displaced onto the landscape and the cityscape that feels sort of aggressive and unwelcoming too. And I think that's interesting to see how that's represented here in the Wayne Thiebaud piece, because you don't actually see any humans. It's a landscape clearly shaped by humans, but you don't see the humans who shaped it, right? Which adds to that dystopian feel, I think.
As you're saying that, it's so true, because the city forms you would expect to see people, and this idea of a densely populated area like San Francisco, yet there's this kind of eeriness that there's no people in the image. Also, I love that sharp geometry of the road that just seems to fall off down the
Mhm.
middle. It's sort of
Yeah.
that degree angle. Some of the students kind of mentioned that as well with this, it's kind of precarious, right? It's not really a livable space.
Hmm. Absolutely. And yet the framing of the image again feels so balanced. Like it's off balance, right? Like that pillar is sort of falling down, and yet it it's just completely split down the middle with the geometric shapes on one side and the curves on the other. I wonder if he might be making some kind of commentary on our relationship to the natural world, the effects of man on our landscape, the environment, etc.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Wayne Thiebaud was known for confections, right? Paintings of pies and cakes and things like this. And so it's very interesting to see him dealing with themes of rural and urban, and this again this clash between human built environment and nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that about him at all. And I mean, nothing about this image looks sweet, right? In fact, in some ways, it's kind of like bitter if I would, associate a taste to it. Just that the grays and the concrete and the sharp edges are just like the opposite of confection.
All right, should we move to the next image?
Sounds good.
All right, so the next image is actually a photograph by Michael Jacobson Hardy, taken in 2001, and it's called South Tower Remains, World Trade Center. So this is really quite an iconic image, I think,
Yeah.
for anybody who lived through this moment, remembering on the news all of the images of New York after the towers came down. It's interesting because it's at night, and so you have these really bright lights in the center area
Mhm.
where you have the loss, but you also see the buildings framing this work.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting, like, where is the artist, and a lot of sort of mystery, I think, about where the artist is and what the artist is doing.
Yeah, I mean, the question of where is the artist is really another way of thinking about the sort of literal perspective of the artist, right? Like, where are they? What is their perspective? But also, what are they trying to convey? What is the perspective that they have on, this scene? And what is the perspective that they want their audience to have as well? Um, and I think also the fact that it's at night and those bright lights is really interesting. The choice of having it be black and white is also really interesting because it makes those lights feel that much more jarring. One of my students commented on that. Sining talked about how jarring the lights felt. And to go back to the name of the piece, I mean, South Tower Remains, just that double entendre on remains is so poignant as well, because of course it's the remains of South Tower, but it's also suggesting that South Tower remains, right? Which of course it doesn't. Physically, it's not there. And yet, what does it mean to say that it does remain, right? And I think some students picked up on the idea of a kind of spirit, like the American spirit persists, right? That you don't see South Tower, it's not there, but you do see all these other buildings, right? And that too is what remains and persists, and the symbolism of that as well. That it's kind of interesting that the title of the picture is of the thing that isn't there, that
Mhm.
you're meant to be viewing a kind of absence. What that means when you realize that there are other things present in that frame as well, right? What those things symbolize. And I was so struck by one of the students saying that their response to the image was actually relief. I think the event of 9/11 is so burned into the American psyche that there's a kind of uh, knee-jerk reaction to it. And I think students imagine, the images that are so ubiquitous of the planes in the towers, or of the falling man, that I just found it so poignant and touching that the reaction to seeing this scene of destruction is one of relief, because it's not the image that we are often confronted with that's of, like violence in motion.
It's true, and it's interesting, as you're saying that, it reminds me of the similarity of the Wayne Thiebaud in the sense that humans aren't the focal point, but instead the remains of humans, what humans build and what, the world that they create,
Mm-hmm.
and in this case, destroy.
Yeah. And so poignant too, again, talking about looking at something at different moments in time, that by now in 2020, we know that what they did with the sites was keep them as memorial sites, right? So it doesn't look like rubble anymore, but it remains there, that space is held, and sort of preserved in a different way, which is just makes looking at this image so poignant.
Really does, and I'm curious, how does this imagery connect with the imagery of the novels that you're reading?
So one student commented that it reminded her of Blade Runner, and I think that has to be because of the existing, the other buildings that are still there, right? The skyscrapers. I'm just so struck by, on the left of the picture, you see that the light glinting off of that enormous skyscraper. So you don't have the one skyscraper that the image is named for, but you do have these other facades and buildings. And again, there's something perhaps sort of dark or dystopian about, the black and white and also the rubble, that again brings the mind to the genre of cyberpunk, and in this case, Blade Runner, which is in fact Los Angeles.
Yeah, and maybe the bright lights too. I sort of
Yeah.
think about some of the imagery of this, the Instagram account where the students are compiling images, and I think you're right about the starkness between the black and black and white in this image. If it were in color, it just wouldn't have that same starkness to it.
And the way that because of the black and white, the way that the light kind of like bleaches that focal point, right, of the rubble and the site of destruction.
So maybe that's a good moment to go to looking at the images together and thinking about how the students thought about them reflected upon both of these images in juxtaposition with one another.
Yeah, so again, I think the most obvious comparison that one student made, which is kind of interesting to me, was that to her, the Thiebaud reminded her of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and the other one reminded her of Blade Runner. And I can sort of see why it would, at the same time that it's funny because the one novel inspired the other film, right? So they're essentially the same story. But what that made me think about is how these aesthetics get constructed. Why is it that Blade Runner is associated with like the one on the left and the novel with the one on the right? Students kind of saw a common theme of destruction or the potential for destruction, and certainly man's hand in the creation of his own end. That was mostly what a lot of them dwelled on.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a sense of emptiness when I look at the two images together. There isn't really a space for humans in these two landscapes.
Which is so interesting because they're human made.
Right, of course. And then also, I think even though there is the color blue in the Wayne Thiebaud, there is kind of a similar aesthetic in the monochromatic quality of both of these. So I think that's really interesting too. But maybe a different mood because you've got the night versus the blue sky in the other one. So
yeah,
I love these two together, and I don't think we have ever put them together before. So thank you so much for creating this combination.
Yeah, I think they worked really well together, and I was so pleased to see what students came up with and how they tied what they were getting out of these images back to the themes of the class.
I think that's the thing that I love the most is being able to see these works anew through the students' eyes and their amazing insights about these works. So thanks to all of your students for their great work on this.
Well, thanks for helping me select the images.